Everyone loved my son's youth pastor. I knew he was dangerous. Pastor Joel Whitmore had been leading the youth ministry at Cornerstone Community Church for 3 years when my 14-year-old son Ethan joined the Wednesday night program. Everyone in the congregation talked about how blessed the church was to have such a dedicated youth leader, how Pastor Joel connected with teenagers in ways previous youth pastors never had, how attendance had tripled since he'd started. My name is Claire Dennison, and from the moment I met Pastor Joel during new member orientation, something in my gut screamed danger. He was 42 years old, married with 2 young daughters, had a theology degree from a respected seminary, and spoke about serving God's children with a passion that made the church board weep with gratitude. But when he shook my hand and told me how excited he was to mentor Ethan spiritually, his grip lasted 3 seconds too long, and his eyes held mine in a way that felt invasive rather than welcoming. My husband David said I was being ridiculous, that I'd developed trust issues after my own difficult childhood with an abusive stepfather. He said I needed to stop projecting my trauma onto every man who showed interest in our son's well-being. The senior pastor, Reverend Thomas Blackwell, had personally vouched for Pastor Joel during the hiring process 3 years ago, describing him as a man of impeccable character who'd transformed struggling youth programs at 2 previous churches. Ethan started attending youth group every Wednesday evening from 6 to 9, coming home energized and happy in ways I hadn't seen since we'd moved to this town 6 months earlier. He'd been struggling with the transition to a new school, hadn't made friends easily, and had become withdrawn and isolated. But after his first youth group meeting, he talked nonstop about how cool Pastor Joel was, how the pastor really understood teenagers, how he didn't talk down to them the way other adults did. David was thrilled that Ethan had found a positive male role model and a peer community through the church. My mother said I should be grateful that Ethan was being exposed to strong Christian leadership instead of the negative influences that corrupted so many teens. The youth group activities seemed wholesome on the surface. Bible study, worship music, community service projects, fellowship activities designed to build faith and friendship. Pastor Joel sent weekly email updates to parents detailing what the group had studied and how each teen was progressing spiritually. The emails were professional and informative, always ending with scripture verses about shepherding God's flock. Within a month, Ethan was attending not just Wednesday meetings, but also Sunday morning youth service, Friday night game nights, and occasional Saturday service projects. Pastor Joel called it building a family of faith for kids who needed belonging and purpose. The first warning sign came 6 weeks into Ethan's involvement when Pastor Joel started texting him directly. Ethan showed me his phone excitedly, explaining that Pastor Joel gave his personal cell number to all the youth group members so they could reach out anytime they were struggling with faith questions or life problems. The texts I saw were innocuous, scripture verses and encouragement, reminders about upcoming events, casual check-ins asking how Ethan's week was going. David said this level of pastoral care was exactly what teens needed, that most youth pastors weren't dedicated enough to make themselves available beyond scheduled meetings. My best friend Monica said her kid's youth pastor did the same thing, and it was considered best practice in modern youth ministry. When I expressed concern to Reverend Blackwell about the appropriateness of private texting between an adult pastor and teenage boys, he assured me that Pastor Joel maintained the highest ethical standards, and that the church's child protection policy permitted pastoral communication with parental knowledge. He said I'd been informed about the texting in the welcome packet and had signed consent forms allowing it. I checked the packet and found the form buried among dozens of other documents, a single paragraph about digital communication being essential to modern ministry. I'd signed without reading carefully, assuming church policies would protect my son. Ethan's phone became an extension of his body, constantly lighting up with messages from Pastor Joel. When I asked what they talked about, Ethan said Pastor Joel was helping him work through his feelings about the move and his struggles at school, that the pastor was someone he could confide in about things he couldn't talk to us about. That statement bothered me deeply, the implication that there were things my son felt he needed to hide from his parents but could share with a man who was essentially a stranger. David said I was being possessive, that teenagers needed adults outside the family to confide in, that this was healthy boundary development. When I tried to read some of the messages, Ethan pulled the phone away and said his conversations with Pastor Joel were private, that the pastor had explained everyone deserved confidentiality in spiritual counseling. Pastor Joel had apparently told the kids that their text conversations were protected by pastoral privilege, the same as if they'd confessed something in a private counseling session. I researched pastoral privilege and found that while it existed in legal contexts, it didn't mean parents couldn't know what adults were discussing with their minor children. But when I brought this up to Reverend Blackwell, he said I was technically correct but morally wrong, that forcing disclosure would damage Ethan's spiritual development and trust in pastoral authority. 2 months into youth group, Pastor Joel introduced a mentorship program where each teen was paired with an adult church member for one-on-one discipleship. Ethan was assigned to Pastor Joel himself, which the pastor framed as an honor reserved for boys who showed exceptional spiritual potential. The mentorship involved weekly breakfast meetings on Saturday mornings at a diner near the church, just the 2 of them discussing faith and life while building a relationship that would support Ethan's growth into Christian manhood. David was proud that Pastor Joel saw something special in Ethan. My mother said it was a blessing that a busy pastor would invest personal time in my son. Monica said her teenage son would kill for that kind of attention from a respected male leader. The Saturday breakfast became routine, with Ethan leaving at 8 and returning around 11, always in a good mood, always sharing vague details about their conversations. Pastor Joel sent me courtesy texts each Saturday confirming pickup and drop-off times, maintaining the appearance of transparency while actually telling me nothing about what happened during those 3 hours. When I asked Ethan for specifics about what they discussed, he'd say they talked about scripture and personal challenges, that Pastor Joel was helping him understand his purpose in God's plan. The answers were rehearsed and meaningless, clearly scripted by the pastor. The church treated Pastor Joel's relationship with Ethan as a model of youth ministry success. During Sunday services, Reverend Blackwell would mention how beautiful it was to see spiritual mentorship flourishing, how Pastor Joel was literally changing kids' lives through individual attention and care. The congregation would nod approvingly, some people coming up to me after service to say how lucky Ethan was to have such a dedicated pastor investing in him. The church newsletter featured an article about the mentorship program with a photo of Pastor Joel and Ethan sitting together at the diner, heads bent over an open Bible. The caption described Pastor Joel as a father figure to fatherless boys and a role model for those whose fathers were present but not spiritually engaged. That article made me furious because it implied David was failing as a father, that our son needed Pastor Joel to fill some void we'd created. When I confronted Reverend Blackwell about the article's insulting characterization of our family, he said I was being oversensitive, that the article was celebrating mentorship generally and not criticizing our parenting specifically. He suggested that my defensiveness might indicate I was feeling convicted about not providing adequate spiritual leadership in our home. The church's implicit message was clear. Questioning Pastor Joel meant questioning your own faith and parenting. 4 months into the mentorship, Ethan asked if he could go on a weekend retreat that Pastor Joel was organizing for his inner circle of mentees. Apparently, there were 6 boys total who Pastor Joel had identified as having leadership potential, boys he wanted to invest in intensively through a camping trip focused on deep spiritual formation. The retreat would be at a church-owned cabin 3 hours away in the mountains, from Friday evening through Sunday afternoon. Just Pastor Joel and the 6 boys. No other adult supervision, no parents, no distractions from the world. David immediately said yes, seeing it as an incredible opportunity for Ethan to bond with other spiritually minded teens and grow closer to God. The church board had approved the retreat and contributed funds from the youth ministry budget to cover costs. Other parents whose sons were invited were thrilled, seeing it as confirmation that their children were spiritually exceptional. When I said I wasn't comfortable with my 14-year-old spending a weekend in an isolated cabin with an adult man I barely knew, David accused me of ruining Ethan's opportunities because of my paranoid mistrust of men. My mother said I was letting my past trauma damage my son's spiritual journey. Monica said I needed to deal with my control issues before I pushed Ethan away entirely. I called each of the other parents whose sons were invited on the retreat, trying to find one person who shared my concerns. 5 families, 5 conversations that went exactly the same way. They were honored that their sons had been chosen. They trusted Pastor Joel completely. They thought the retreat would be transformative for the boys' faith development. One mother said she wished all youth pastors were as dedicated as Pastor Joel. One father said his son had been struggling with anger issues, and Pastor Joel's mentorship had completely turned him around. Another mother said her son had been suicidal the previous year, and Pastor Joel had literally saved his life through intensive pastoral counseling. These families saw Pastor Joel as a hero who'd rescued their troubled teenagers from darkness. They thought I was ungrateful and paranoid for questioning his methods. When I suggested that having only one adult supervisor for 6 teenage boys violated basic child safety protocols, they said I was applying secular standards to spiritual ministry, that God's protection was better than any human safety policy. I researched the church's official child protection guidelines and found they did require a 2-adult rule for all youth activities, that no adult should be alone with minors in isolated settings. But when I brought this to Reverend Blackwell, he said the policy allowed exceptions for pastoral counseling, and that he'd personally approved this retreat as an extended counseling session. I told David that Ethan wasn't going on the retreat, that the whole situation violated basic safety principles, and my parental instinct was screaming danger. David said I was being irrational and controlling, that if I forbade Ethan from going, it would damage his relationship with the church, with his peers, and with us. He said my refusal to trust appropriate male mentorship was rooted in my own issues, and I needed to stop projecting those issues onto our son. We fought about it for 3 days, the worst conflict our marriage had seen in years. Ethan cried and begged to go, saying I was ruining his life, that I didn't understand how important this was to his faith and his friendships. He said Pastor Joel had specifically chosen him for this retreat because he saw leadership potential, and refusing would mean letting down God and the pastor who'd invested so much in him. The emotional manipulation was obvious to me, guilt and obligation weaponized to override normal parental caution. But to David and Ethan, my concerns were the manipulation, my trauma making me see danger where only blessing existed. I finally compromised, saying Ethan could go, but I wanted to speak with Pastor Joel first about safety protocols and emergency procedures. Pastor Joel agreed immediately to meet with me, his willingness to engage my concerns used as evidence that he had nothing to hide. Pastor Joel met me at the church on a Thursday afternoon in his office, a comfortable room decorated with Christian posters and youth ministry awards. He greeted me warmly, thanked me for caring so much about Ethan's safety, and said he understood that protective parents sometimes needed reassurance. He walked me through the retreat schedule, showing me detailed plans for Bible study sessions, worship times, recreation activities, and rest periods. He showed me photos of the cabin with its bunk beds, kitchen, common areas, and emphasized it was church property that had been used for youth retreats for decades. He explained the emergency protocols, the nearest hospital 20 minutes away, the cell phone coverage that would allow him to contact emergency services if needed. He assured me that the retreat was about spiritual formation, not about isolating boys from their families, and that parents were welcome to call or text anytime during the weekend. Everything he said was reasonable and professional. Every concern I raised had a prepared answer that made me feel foolish for asking. When I mentioned the 2-adult rule in the church policy, he showed me the formal exemption Reverend Blackwell had signed, emphasizing that pastoral counseling operated under different standards than general youth activities. When I asked why he didn't invite another adult leader to join them, he explained that the intimacy of the retreat required a small group where the boys would feel safe being vulnerable about their faith struggles. He said adding another adult would change the dynamic and prevent the kind of deep sharing these boys needed. The retreat went ahead as scheduled. Ethan left on Friday evening, excited and grateful that I'd overcome my fears enough to let him participate. David said he was proud of me for not letting my anxiety control our parenting decisions. Pastor Joel sent courtesy texts throughout the weekend, photos of the boys doing Bible study and hiking and making meals together, everyone smiling and engaged. The other parents posted on social media about how blessed they were that their sons were having this spiritual experience. I barely slept all weekend, my phone in my hand constantly, waiting for something to go wrong. But nothing did. Ethan came home Sunday afternoon, sunburned and tired and happier than I'd seen him in months. He talked about the deep conversations they'd had about faith and purpose, about how close he felt to the other guys now, about how Pastor Joel had shared personal struggles from his own life that made the boys feel less alone in their challenges. David said the retreat had clearly been exactly what Ethan needed. My mother said she hoped I'd learn to trust God's plan instead of fighting it. Monica said maybe now I'd relax and stop seeing danger in healthy mentorship. But something had changed in Ethan that weekend. He was happier but also more secretive. He spent hours in his room texting, his phone lighting up constantly with messages I wasn't allowed to see. When I asked who he was talking to, he'd say it was the guys from the retreat, that they had a group chat where they supported each other spiritually. Pastor Joel had apparently created a private messaging group for his mentees, encouraging them to stay connected and accountable to each other throughout the week. The concept sounded healthy on the surface, teenage boys supporting each other's faith. But Ethan's attachment to his phone became obsessive. He took it everywhere, checked it constantly, smiled at messages in ways that seemed more secretive than spiritual. When I tried to look over his shoulder, he'd angle the screen away or close the app entirely. David said this was normal teenage behavior, that I needed to respect Ethan's privacy. When I mentioned my concerns to Pastor Joel during a chance encounter at church, he said the boys were building brotherhood in Christ, and that their group chat was a sacred space where they processed their spiritual journeys together. He said attempting to monitor it would violate their trust and undermine the mentorship program's effectiveness. 6 months into the mentorship, Pastor Joel invited Ethan to start helping with Wednesday youth group as a junior leader. The position involved arriving early to set up, staying late to clean up, and occasionally helping Pastor Joel with administrative tasks in his office. David was thrilled that Ethan was being given leadership responsibility so young. The church treated it as an honor, announcing during Sunday service that Ethan had been selected for the Junior Leader program. Reverend Blackwell said publicly that Pastor Joel had identified Ethan as a young man with exceptional spiritual maturity who would someday be a leader in the church. The recognition made Ethan glow with pride. It also meant he was spending even more time alone with Pastor Joel, arriving at youth group at 5 instead of 6, staying until 10 instead of 9, 5 additional hours per week in private settings with an adult I didn't trust. When I objected, Ethan said I was trying to sabotage his spiritual growth because I couldn't handle him having relationships outside the family. David agreed, saying I was being controlling and needed to see a therapist about my trust issues. The church's collective message reinforced this, my concerns reframed as personal pathology rather than legitimate parental caution. The pattern continued escalating. More time with Pastor Joel, more private messages, more activities that excluded parents. Pastor Joel started taking Ethan to lunch after church on Sundays, just the two of them, discussing spiritual matters that Ethan wouldn't share with us. The pastor invited Ethan to his home for dinner with his family, saying it was important for mentees to see healthy Christian family dynamics. Ethan came home from those dinners praising Pastor Joel's wife Rebecca for her hospitality and talking about how fun the pastor's daughters were. The involvement of Pastor Joel's family was used as evidence that the relationship was appropriate, that a married man with children couldn't possibly have inappropriate intentions toward teenage boys. But I noticed that the dinners were specifically scheduled when David was traveling for work, when I'd be alone at home, when I couldn't easily object without seeming paranoid and controlling. Pastor Joel was methodically creating more access to my son while positioning himself as beyond suspicion through his family involvement and church authority. 8 months into the mentorship, I discovered Ethan had been lying about his whereabouts. He'd told me he was going to a friend's house after school, but his friend's mother called looking for him, saying she'd expected him an hour ago. I tried his cell phone repeatedly with no answer. I called David at work in a panic. I called Pastor Joel to ask if Ethan had shown up at church for some reason. Pastor Joel said yes. Actually, Ethan had asked to come work on a project for youth group and was in the pastor's office right now, that he should have reminded Ethan to tell me about the change of plans. He put Ethan on the phone and my son apologized casually, saying he'd forgotten to text me. The incident seemed minor, but it revealed a pattern I'd been missing. How many other times had Ethan lied about his location to spend time with Pastor Joel? How many supposed friend hangouts or study sessions had actually been meetings with the pastor? When I confronted Ethan about lying, he said he hadn't lied exactly. He'd just changed plans and forgotten to mention it. When I said he'd specifically told me he was going to his friend's house, he said I must have misunderstood him. The gaslighting was textbook manipulation. When I told David what had happened, he said I was making a big deal out of a teenager being forgetful. When I expressed concerns to Pastor Joel, he apologized for not ensuring Ethan contacted me, but said he was glad Ethan felt comfortable enough to seek out church as a safe space when he needed support. I started watching Ethan more carefully, tracking his patterns and inconsistencies. I discovered he'd been lying about multiple locations and activities over several months. Study groups that never existed. Friends he claimed to be visiting who hadn't seen him in weeks. Sports practices that had been canceled but that Ethan still claimed to attend. Each lie was small enough to seem like miscommunication or teen absent-mindedness. But together they formed a pattern of deception that allowed Ethan to spend unaccounted time somewhere, presumably with Pastor Joel. When I documented the lies and confronted David with the pattern, he said I was conducting surveillance on our son because of my paranoid mistrust of healthy relationships. He said my behavior was damaging Ethan's development and our marriage. My mother said I needed psychiatric help. Monica said I was spiraling into obsessive behavior and should talk to someone before I destroyed my family. The universal message was that I was the problem. My concerns the symptom of mental instability rather than legitimate evidence of something wrong. I did something I'd never done before. I went through Ethan's room when he was at school, searching for anything that would explain the lying and secretiveness. I felt like a terrible mother invading his privacy, but my instinct was screaming that he was in danger. I found a journal hidden under his mattress, a small notebook filled with handwritten entries. The entries were disturbing. Ethan wrote about feeling special and chosen, about Pastor Joel being the only person who truly understood him, about his parents being spiritually blind and unable to see God's plan. He wrote about the other mentees as brothers in a special group that existed outside normal church structures. He wrote about keeping secrets from his parents because they wouldn't understand the depth of his relationship with Pastor Joel. He wrote about feeling guilty when he talked to his parents because it felt like betraying Pastor Joel. The entries were dated over 6 months, showing a progression of emotional dependency and family alienation. There were also photos printed and tucked into the journal, pictures of Ethan with Pastor Joel and the other mentees, all of them casual and seemingly innocent, but the sheer number of photos suggested an obsession. Ethan had written captions under some photos describing them as his real family, his spiritual brothers, his true home. I photographed every page of the journal with my phone, knowing I needed evidence of what was happening. Then I put everything back exactly as I'd found it. I called my sister, who worked as a therapist in another state, described everything I'd found without identifying anyone. She listened carefully and said what I was describing sounded like grooming behavior, that Pastor Joel was systematically isolating Ethan emotionally from his family while creating inappropriate dependency and intimacy. She said the lying, the secretiveness, the special chosen status, the private communications, the excessive time alone, the manipulation of Ethan's perception of his parents, all of it fit patterns of abusive authority figures who created inappropriate relationships with vulnerable targets. She said I needed to document everything and remove Ethan from the situation immediately. She warned that people in religious communities often denied or minimized this kind of abuse because they couldn't reconcile their image of godly leadership with predatory behavior. She said I should expect resistance from everyone, that I'd be portrayed as the problem, but that I needed to protect my son regardless of the social cost. I showed David the journal photographs that evening after Ethan went to bed. I walked him through each entry, explained the patterns my sister had identified, begged him to see what was happening. He read through everything slowly, and I watched his face shift from skepticism to concern. He said the journal entries were troubling, that some of what Ethan had written did seem like unhealthy emotional dependency. But then he backtracked, saying teenage boys often idolized male mentors, and this might just be normal adolescent hero worship. He said the entries about us being spiritually blind were hurtful, but probably just teenage rebellion expressed through religious language. He agreed the photos were excessive, but said boys this age obsessed over things that mattered to them, whether that was sports figures or video games or in this case youth ministry. He said we should talk to Pastor Joel about pulling back the mentorship intensity, but he didn't agree the situation was abusive or dangerous. He accused me of seeing my own childhood trauma in a situation that was probably just a teenager struggling with identity development. The conversation ended with him saying he'd talk to Pastor Joel about boundaries, but that I needed to stop my surveillance behavior because it was unhealthy for everyone. David met with Pastor Joel privately without telling me when or where, coming home to report that the pastor was concerned about my accusations and my behavior. According to David, Pastor Joel had suggested I might be experiencing a mental health crisis, that my obsessive focus on the mentorship was disrupting Ethan's spiritual growth and family relationships. Pastor Joel had apparently pointed out that many of my concerns stemmed from misinterpreting normal mentorship activities through a lens of suspicion, that my childhood abuse history was making me see danger in healthy relationships. He'd offered to reduce his communication with Ethan if that would ease my anxiety, positioning himself as accommodating and concerned while actually suggesting I was mentally unstable. David told me Pastor Joel wanted to meet with both of us to discuss my concerns in a pastoral counseling setting, where we could work through my trust issues with spiritual guidance. The entire conversation had been reframed around my pathology, my accusations transformed into symptoms of my disorder, my protective instincts pathologized as paranoia. David asked me to agree to the pastoral counseling session to prove I was acting in good faith. The trap was elegant. Refusing would confirm I was unreasonable. Attending would mean submitting to Pastor Joel's authority and spiritual manipulation. I refused the counseling session with Pastor Joel and instead called a child welfare hotline anonymously, describing the situation and asking what I should do. The caseworker I spoke with said that without evidence of physical or sexual abuse, there was little they could investigate. Emotional manipulation and inappropriate boundaries in mentorship relationships were concerning, but not necessarily illegal. She said if I believed my son was in danger, I should remove him from the situation, but that as the mother, I had the authority to do that without needing state intervention. She said I might face custody challenges if my husband disagreed with my assessment, that family courts generally preferred to keep both parents involved in decisions unless there was clear evidence of harm. She suggested I might want to consult with a family lawyer about my options. The call was helpful in clarifying that I had to act alone, that institutions wouldn't protect my son unless I did. I called a family attorney who specialized in custody disputes and explained the situation. She said I was in a difficult position because removing Ethan from church activities over my husband's objection could be seen as parental alienation. She advised me to gather more concrete evidence before taking dramatic action, to document everything, to see if I could get Pastor Joel to reveal his intentions more clearly. I decided to create a situation that would force Pastor Joel to show his hand. I texted him and asked to meet privately to discuss concerns about Ethan. He agreed immediately, suggesting we meet at a coffee shop near the church. The meeting was scheduled for a Friday afternoon when David was at work and Ethan was at school. Pastor Joel arrived on time, dressed casually, greeting me warmly. He ordered coffee for both of us and sat down with an expression of pastoral concern. He started by saying he understood I had questions about his mentorship of Ethan, that he wanted to address anything that was causing me anxiety. I told him directly that I believed the relationship had become inappropriately intense, that Ethan was showing signs of emotional dependency and family alienation that concerned me. I said I wanted the mentorship to end, and Ethan to have normal youth group participation without the private meetings and constant communication. Pastor Joel listened carefully, nodding sympathetically, and then began his response. He said he understood my concerns but believed they stemmed from misunderstanding the nature of spiritual mentorship, and possibly from my own traumatic history affecting my perception of male relationships. He said Ethan was a spiritually gifted young man who needed intensive guidance to develop his leadership potential, that pulling back now would damage the progress they'd made and potentially cause Ethan to lose faith entirely. He said the emotional intensity I interpreted as dependency was actually healthy attachment in the context of spiritual formation, that biblical mentorship required depth of relationship that modern society often misunderstood as inappropriate. He cited examples from Scripture of deep same-sex spiritual friendships and mentorships, David and Jonathan, Paul and Timothy, Jesus and John. He said parents often struggled when their children developed strong bonds with spiritual leaders because it challenged their control and authority. He suggested that my resistance to his mentorship of Ethan was actually resistance to Ethan maturing spiritually beyond what I could guide him toward. Every word was calculated to make me feel foolish and inadequate, to position my concerns as spiritual deficiency. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. He said Ethan had confided in him about tensions at home, about feeling like he had to choose between his family and his faith, about fears that I would try to separate him from the church community. He said Ethan had asked Pastor Joel what would happen if his parents tried to stop him from attending youth group. But Pastor Joel told me that he'd assured Ethan that the church would support him in maintaining his spiritual life regardless of parental opposition, that if it came to that, there were options for teens to remain involved in church even when parents tried to interfere. The implications were clear. Pastor Joel was preparing Ethan for the possibility that I would attempt to end the mentorship, and was positioning the church as Ethan's true family who would protect him from his controlling mother. He was creating a scenario where any action I took to protect my son would be framed as persecution, where Ethan would be encouraged to resist my authority, where the church would back him up against me. Pastor Joel finished by saying he hoped we could work together for Ethan's benefit, but that if I chose to disrupt the mentorship, I should understand that Ethan was old enough to have opinions about his own spiritual life and the church would respect his choices. It was a threat delivered with pastoral gentleness. Back off or lose your son completely. I thanked him for his time and left the coffee shop feeling sick, knowing I'd just confirmed that Pastor Joel saw Ethan as his and was willing to fight me for him. I told David everything about the meeting. I explained Pastor Joel's threat about supporting Ethan against us, His suggestion that the church would help Ethan maintain relationships with them regardless of our wishes. David was finally disturbed, agreeing that Pastor Joel had crossed a line by suggesting he'd support Ethan in defying us. But he still didn't see the relationship as abusive, just as poorly boundaried. He wanted to talk to Reverend Blackwell about reining in Pastor Joel's approach while keeping Ethan in the youth program under better supervision. I said that wasn't enough, that the whole dynamic was toxic and Ethan needed to be completely separated from Pastor Joel immediately. We fought again, David accusing me of wanting to isolate Ethan from church because of my paranoia, me accusing him of being blind to obvious grooming because he was intimidated by Pastor Joel's authority. The fight ended with David saying he'd talk to Reverend Blackwell the next day, but that I needed to stop pushing for dramatic actions that would traumatize Ethan. I agreed to wait for David's conversation with the senior pastor before taking any action on my own. David met with Reverend Blackwell the following Monday and came home destroyed. According to David, the Reverend had been aware of concerns about Pastor Joel for months because apparently I wasn't the first parent to question the appropriateness of his methods. 3 other families had raised concerns over the past 2 years about boundary issues, inappropriate intensity in relationships, and time with their sons that felt exclusive and possessive. In each case, Reverend Blackwell had investigated and determined that Pastor Joel was practicing biblical mentorship that some modern parents found uncomfortable, but that was actually rooted in historical Christian tradition. He'd counseled the concerned parents about releasing control and trusting God's work in their children's lives. 2 of the 3 families had left the church, unable to reconcile their concerns with the community's unwavering support for Pastor Joel. The 3rd family had allowed their son to continue in the program, and that son was now 17 and one of Pastor Joel's most devoted disciples, planning to attend Bible college to become a youth pastor himself, rarely speaking to his parents anymore. Reverend Blackwell told David that concerns about Pastor Joel always came from parents struggling with their own control issues, that the pastor's methods were unconventional but produced remarkable spiritual fruit in the teenagers he mentored. He said the church leadership had complete confidence in Pastor Joel's character and calling. David came home from that meeting finally seeing what I'd been seeing for months. Reverend Blackwell's description of the other families' experiences made him realize the pattern wasn't just about Ethan, that Pastor Joel systematically created intense relationships with teenage boys that alienated them from their families. He'd talked to one of the fathers whose family had left the church, getting details that Reverend Blackwell hadn't shared. That father described his son's transformation from a close family relationship to complete emotional dependence on Pastor Joel over 8 months. He described finding inappropriate messages between his son and the pastor, messages that weren't sexual but were emotionally intimate in ways that felt wrong. He described his son lying about whereabouts to spend time with Pastor Joel. He described the church community rallying around the pastor when he tried to raise concerns, making him feel crazy for questioning a godly man's intentions. That father had eventually pulled his son out of the church entirely, moving to another town to get away from Pastor Joel's influence. He said it took 2 years of therapy for his son to understand he'd been groomed, and even now at 18, the son sometimes defended Pastor Joel and blamed his father for overreacting. David finally believed me completely, and we agreed we had to act immediately to protect Ethan, even if it meant social consequences and Ethan's resistance. We decided to pull Ethan out of Cornerstone Community Church entirely, to find a different church with safer youth programming, and to be completely honest with him about why. That evening after dinner, we sat Ethan down and explained that he wouldn't be returning to youth group, that we had serious concerns about Pastor Joel's methods and boundaries. Ethan's reaction was explosive. He screamed that we were destroying his life, that Pastor Joel was the only person who understood him, that we were trying to separate him from God. He said he hated us, that he'd find a way to stay connected to the church regardless of what we said. He locked himself in his room for hours, and we could hear him on the phone having agitated conversations. Pastor Joel called my cell phone within 30 minutes of our conversation with Ethan, saying he'd heard we were preventing Ethan from attending church and asking if we could discuss this as a church family. I told him he needed to stop contacting our son immediately, that his relationship with Ethan had crossed boundaries and was ending effective immediately. Pastor Joel said he was disappointed that I was letting my psychological issues damage Ethan's faith, but that he would respect our decision while praying for our family to heal from whatever darkness was causing this conflict. The next day, Reverend Blackwell called and asked us to come to a meeting with the church elders to discuss our concerns about Pastor Joel in a formal setting. We agreed, hoping that presenting our evidence to the full leadership might result in accountability. The meeting was Thursday evening. 7 church elders plus Reverend Blackwell, David and me, and Pastor Joel, who'd been invited to defend himself against our accusations. We presented everything: the journal entries, the pattern of lies about whereabouts, the excessive communication, the emotional dependency, the statements Pastor Joel had made about supporting Ethan against us, the history of similar concerns from other families. The elders listened carefully and asked questions. Then Pastor Joel responded. He presented himself as a dedicated servant being attacked by a troubled mother who couldn't accept her son's spiritual growth beyond her control. He provided character references from other families, including the parents of the 17-year-old who praised his transformative influence on their son. He explained each concern in ways that sounded reasonable. The journal entries were normal adolescent processing. The time together was appropriate mentorship. The communication was pastoral care. He suggested that I needed professional help for my paranoia and trauma, that my false accusations were damaging both him and Ethan. The elders deliberated for 30 minutes and returned with their decision. They found no evidence of inappropriate behavior by Pastor Joel. They affirmed their confidence in his ministry and methods. They suggested that David and I seek counseling to address our marital conflict and my mental health concerns. They said Ethan was welcome to continue in youth group if we changed our minds, but that the church would not force Pastor Joel to end his mentorship since they believed it was beneficial and appropriate. They did note that going forward, Pastor Joel should be more mindful of communicating regularly with parents and perhaps reducing the intensity of individual relationships to prevent misunderstandings. The mild suggestion to adjust his approach was presented as gracious accommodation of parental anxiety, not as acknowledgement of any actual wrongdoing. We left the meeting devastated, knowing the church had chosen to protect Pastor Joel rather than investigate our concerns seriously. We learned later that one elder had privately agreed with us but felt pressured by the majority to go along with the exoneration. That elder eventually left the church himself after seeing Pastor Joel develop similarly intense relationships with other boys. Over the next month, Ethan became increasingly withdrawn and hostile at home. He refused to attend the new church we'd found, saying it was boring and fake compared to Cornerstone. He spent hours texting his friends from youth group who told him his parents were persecuting Pastor Joel and trying to separate him from God's plan. Several parents from Cornerstone called us expressing concern that we were spiritually harming Ethan by removing him from the church community. Some called it spiritual abuse to prevent a child from worshiping where he felt called. The social pressure was immense, our family becoming isolated as the church community rallied around Pastor Joel and against us. Ethan began sneaking out to attend Wednesday youth group without our knowledge, having other families pick him up from school and drive him there. When we discovered this, we confronted him, and he said he was old enough to make his own decisions about faith and we couldn't stop him from going to church. Legally, he was right. At 14, we couldn't physically restrain him from attending youth activities, and forcing the issue would likely drive him further away. I contacted the youth pastor at our new church and explained the situation, asking if there were resources for dealing with teens who'd been involved in spiritually abusive situations. That pastor connected me with a counselor named Dr. Helen Gray, who specialized in religious trauma and cultic group dynamics. Dr. Gray said what I was describing was textbook grooming and spiritual manipulation, that Pastor Joel had used his authority and Ethan's vulnerabilities to create inappropriate dependency and control. She said Ethan likely wouldn't see it that way for months or even years, that victims of this kind of manipulation typically defended their abusers because recognizing the truth meant confronting painful realities about having been exploited. She said our job was to maintain connection with Ethan while setting firm boundaries, to make sure he knew we loved him regardless of his anger toward us, and to be patient as he eventually worked through what had happened. She said most teenagers who'd been groomed this way eventually realized it, especially as they aged and gained perspective, but that the timeline varied dramatically. Some realized it within months once they were out of the relationship. Others took years. Some never fully recognized it and remained emotionally bonded to their abusers for life. I became obsessed with finding a way to prove Pastor Joel was dangerous, to force accountability that would protect not just Ethan but the other boys he was mentoring. I started documenting everything, taking screenshots of social media posts from youth group families, tracking which boys spent excessive time with Pastor Joel, noting patterns of parent complaints and online church reviews. I found that Cornerstone Community Church had a pattern of high turnover in families with teenage sons, that many families quietly left after a year or two in the youth program without explaining why. I tracked down 3 more families who'd left the church over concerns about Pastor Joel, all with similar stories of inappropriate intensity, emotional dependency, and family alienation. 2 of those families were willing to provide written statements describing their experiences. One family's son had ultimately attempted suicide after Pastor Joel abruptly ended their mentorship when the boy expressed doubt about the pastor's methods, leaving the teenager devastated and abandoned. That family had quietly settled with the church for damages related to inadequate supervision, with non-disclosure agreements preventing them from discussing the incident publicly. Armed with testimony from multiple families and documentation of a pattern, I contacted the denominational office that oversaw Cornerstone Community Church. I spoke with a regional administrator who handled clergy misconduct allegations. I presented all my evidence and the statements from other families. The administrator listened carefully and said they would open an investigation into Pastor Joel's conduct. The investigation took 3 months, during which Pastor Joel continued his ministry uninterrupted. The investigator interviewed us, interviewed Ethan, interviewed other families, interviewed Pastor Joel and the church elders, and reviewed documentation. The final report found that while Pastor Joel's methods were unconventional and had created some misunderstandings with families, there was insufficient evidence of intentional harm or abuse. The report noted that Pastor Joel should improve communication with parents and suggested the church implement better oversight of youth ministry activities. But it stopped short of finding misconduct or recommending any disciplinary action. The denominational office sent a copy of the report to Reverend Blackwell with recommendations for improving youth ministry oversight. The church leadership celebrated the report as vindication of Pastor Joel, announcing to the congregation that baseless accusations had been investigated and dismissed by proper authorities. I felt completely defeated until I received an unexpected message through social media from a woman named Alexis Hart. She identified herself as a former member of a church where Pastor Joel had worked 10 years earlier before coming to Cornerstone. She said she'd seen my complaints in church review forums and needed to talk to me about Pastor Joel's history. We met at a restaurant in a town 30 miles away. Alexis was now 32 years old, married with children, and working as a victim advocate for a nonprofit. She told me that when she was 19, she'd been a volunteer youth leader at the church where Pastor Joel worked. Over several months, he'd developed what she thought was a friendly mentorship relationship with her, but it gradually became inappropriate. He'd started texting her constantly, inviting her to private meetings, telling her she was special and gifted, creating emotional dependency. The relationship had eventually become sexual when she turned 20, with Pastor Joel framing it as a spiritual connection blessed by God. The affair lasted 8 months before she realized she'd been groomed and manipulated. When she tried to report it to church leadership, Pastor Joel claimed she'd pursued him, and he'd tried to resist but had fallen into temptation. The church leadership blamed her for tempting a godly man, asked her to leave quietly, and swept the incident under the rug. Pastor Joel had resigned from that position and moved to a different state, starting fresh at another church where his past wouldn't follow him. Alexis said she'd tried to warn people about Pastor Joel for years, but that he was skilled at choosing victims who'd struggle to be believed, at building protective relationships with church leadership, at creating plausible deniability for his actions. She said she'd heard rumors of similar situations at the church between ours and the one where she'd known him, a pattern of inappropriate relationships that he managed to escape consequences for by moving on before anything became public. She said she hadn't been able to prove the pattern conclusively enough to pursue legal action, but she'd dedicated herself to tracking his movement and trying to warn communities when he surfaced. She gave me contact information for 2 other women from different churches who'd had similar experiences with Pastor Joel, both of whom had been young adults working in youth ministry when he'd groomed them into inappropriate relationships. She also gave me the name of a journalist who specialized in investigative reporting on religious abuse, saying he'd been interested in doing a story about Pastor Joel but needed more sources willing to go on record. She asked if I'd be willing to share Ethan's story publicly to help expose the pattern. I said I needed to talk to David and consider the impact on Ethan before making that decision. The journalist's name was Derek Vaughn, and he worked for a regional news organization that covered religious institutions. I called him and explained the situation with Ethan and the history Alexis had shared. Derek said he'd been investigating Pastor Joel for 2 years based on tips from multiple sources, but that getting people to go on record was difficult because of fear of retaliation from churches, and because many victims were still processing trauma and weren't ready for public exposure. He said if I was willing to speak publicly, and if he could get the other families from Cornerstone to also speak, he might have enough for a story that would finally bring accountability. I contacted the other families who'd left the church over concerns about Pastor Joel. 2 of them agreed to participate in the investigation anonymously. 1 agreed to go on record with her full name. The father whose son had attempted suicide after Pastor Joel ended their relationship agreed to share his story despite the non-disclosure agreement, saying he'd rather face legal consequences than allow more children to be harmed. Derek interviewed all of us extensively, verified details through church documents and social media evidence, contacted the denominational office for comment, and reached out to Pastor Joel for his response. Pastor Joel declined to be interviewed but had his lawyer send a letter threatening legal action if any story was published that defamed his character. Derek's investigation took 4 months. During that time, Ethan continued attending Cornerstone youth groups sporadically, still angry at us but slowly becoming less invested as he started to see inconsistencies in Pastor Joel's behavior toward him now that we'd created distance. Pastor Joel had moved on to focusing his attention on other boys whose parents were less questioning, and Ethan was experiencing what felt like abandonment as he was no longer the special chosen one. This shift in dynamics was painful for Ethan but ultimately helpful in breaking the emotional dependency. He started opening up to Dr. Gray in therapy, talking about feeling confused about why Pastor Joel didn't text him as much anymore, why he wasn't invited to special activities, why other boys seemed to be replacing him in the inner circle. Dr. Gray gently helped Ethan explore what it meant that Pastor Joel's attention was conditional and what that suggested about the nature of their relationship. The story was published on a Wednesday morning as a 5,000-word investigative piece titled Pattern of Manipulation, Youth Pastor Accused of Grooming Boys Across Multiple Churches. The article documented Pastor Joel's history across 3 churches over 15 years, detailed allegations from Alexis and the other women he'd groomed, presented testimony from multiple families at Cornerstone, including ours, and raised questions about denominational failures to track and respond to complaints across church locations. The response was immediate and intense. The story was shared thousands of times on social media. Other families from Cornerstone who'd quietly left the church began reaching out with their own stories. Former youth group members, now adults, started coming forward to describe their experiences with Pastor Joel's inappropriate intensity and boundary violations. The denominational office issued a statement saying they took the allegations seriously and were launching a formal investigation. Within 48 hours of publication, Cornerstone Community Church announced that Pastor Joel had been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. Reverend Blackwell issued a statement defending the church's previous handling of complaints, while also saying they were cooperating fully with denominational investigators. The congregation split dramatically, with some families supporting Pastor Joel and claiming he was being persecuted by parents who misunderstood biblical mentorship, while others expressed shock at the pattern described in the article and questioned why leadership had dismissed so many concerns. Several families announced they were leaving the church. The elders who'd voted to exonerate Pastor Joel faced intense criticism from congregation members who felt betrayed. 3 of the 7 elders resigned within a week. The denominational investigation took 2 months and resulted in a comprehensive report that validated most of the concerns raised in Derek's article. Investigators found that Pastor Joel had a consistent pattern across multiple churches of forming inappropriately intense relationships with teenage boys and young adults, creating emotional dependency that interfered with family relationships and failing to maintain appropriate professional boundaries. The report noted that his relationships with adult women at previous churches had crossed into sexual misconduct on at least 3 occasions, all involving women who'd been in youth ministry roles under his supervision. The report concluded that Pastor Joel had consistently used his authority as a spiritual leader to manipulate vulnerable individuals into relationships that served his emotional needs rather than their spiritual development. The denomination revoked his ministerial credentials permanently and reported him to a national database that tracked credentialed religious leaders who'd been disciplined for misconduct. This meant he couldn't easily obtain credentials with another denomination or move to another church without his history being known. Cornerstone Community Church was placed on probation by the denomination and required to implement comprehensive child protection policies with outside oversight. Pastor Joel's wife, Rebecca, filed for divorce 3 weeks after the investigation results were published. Court documents revealed she'd been unaware of the full extent of his inappropriate relationships and felt betrayed both personally and spiritually. She moved with their daughters to another state to start over. Pastor Joel hired an attorney and issued a statement denying all wrongdoing, claiming he was the victim of a coordinated attack by troubled families who couldn't accept biblical approaches to youth ministry. He suggested the allegations were motivated by his unwillingness to compromise biblical truth to accommodate modern sensitivities. His statement was widely criticized as defensive and narcissistic, showing no recognition of harm caused or responsibility taken. Several former youth group members, now adults, wrote public responses describing how they'd been harmed by his manipulation and how his statement demonstrated his continued lack of insight or remorse. One young man wrote about years of therapy needed to recover from the emotional damage of Pastor Joel's grooming, describing how the pastor had destroyed his relationship with his parents and left him unable to trust authority figures or form healthy relationships. Ethan's healing process was slow and nonlinear. Reading the article and seeing the pattern described by multiple families helped him understand that his experience wasn't unique or special, that he'd been targeted and manipulated using tactics Pastor Joel had perfected over years. But accepting this meant grieving the relationship he thought he'd had, acknowledging he'd been used rather than genuinely loved. Dr. Gray helped him work through complex emotions including anger at Pastor Joel, anger at himself for not seeing the manipulation, anger at us for being right, and grief for the loss of what he'd believed was the most important relationship in his life. Therapy helped him understand that the intensity he'd experienced as deep spiritual connection was actually engineered dependency designed to serve Pastor Joel's needs for control and adoration. Ethan wrote a statement that was included in the denominational investigation, describing his experience in detail and how it had affected him. Writing the statement was cathartic but also painful, requiring him to examine his own participation in lying to us and rejecting our concerns. He apologized to us for his hostility and for defending Pastor Joel against our legitimate concerns, saying he understood now that we'd been trying to protect him, even when he couldn't see the danger. The apology meant everything to us, though we told him he didn't need to apologize for being manipulated by an adult in authority who'd exploited his vulnerabilities. 2 years after the article was published, Derek wrote a follow-up story about Pastor Joel's current situation and the broader implications for how churches handle abuse by trusted leaders. The follow-up revealed that Pastor Joel had moved to a small town in another state and was attempting to start an independent church not affiliated with any denomination, marketing himself as a persecuted prophet who'd been driven out of institutional Christianity for standing firm on biblical truth. Several former youth group members from Cornerstone had found his new church online and were attending, still loyal to him despite everything that had been revealed. The story noted that without denominational oversight or legal restrictions, Pastor Joel was free to continue his ministry and potentially harm more vulnerable people. This reality was frustrating, but also motivated us to continue advocacy work. I started speaking at churches and youth ministry conferences about recognizing grooming behaviors and the importance of robust child protection policies. Several families from our support network became advocates as well, working to educate parents and church leaders about the tactics manipulative leaders use and the systemic failures that enable them. Ethan joined us in some of this advocacy work as he felt ready, sharing his story to help other teenagers recognize when relationships with authority figures crossed into manipulation and control. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.